Fantasy football. T5 League Beauty Review.
Alright, so we're in our fourth matchup of round one for our wide receiver 1 elimination bracket challenge. And in this matchup, we have New England's Demario Douglas going up against Jacksonville's Brian Thomas Jr. Now, one thing I like to do in these videos, I like to try and recall throughout the course of the season. How often do I see these players making highlight reels, whether that's through social media or some of the more established media organizations for sports? One thing that came to mind was Brian Thomas did have this one really big play with Jacksonville, and at that time I remember thinking, like, dang, this guy is going to be a problem for everybody else in the AFC South. And then we've had a couple years to see Demario Douglas develop. They think that they have their solution with Drake May at the quarterback. So that should only give him better opportunities in order to showcase his skill set. And we're going to do a deeper dive of how we would expect him to line up within that offensive system. Is he going to be working out of the slot, or are we going to see him outside on the perimeter? Because that's going to be very important, for how many targets he gets, in addition to how many yards and how many opportunities he's going to have to go to the house. So now that we have our two opponents, let's go ahead and jump into the stats. All right, so as you can see, I've already moved in all the fantasy information for Demario Douglas and Brian Thomas Jr. into Excel. This way we can kind of look at it from a more analytical perspective and have some visual aids, because those are always very helpful. So on the left-hand side, we have Demario Douglas. Demario Douglas had 9 bust weeks and 1 boom week. So just to recap, any bust week is a week where they score less than 10 points, and any boom week is a week in which they score more than 20 points. So Demario Douglas ended up at 62 in the player rankings. So that's not a very good stat for fantasy owners. When we look further into it, we'll see that he had 66 receptions on the year. He had 621 yards with 3 touchdowns on 87 targets. Now we can expect that to go up with Drake May next year as that offense gels together a little bit better. He also had 3 carries for 16 yards. The best week that Demario Thomas had was against Houston, Texas, where he put up a stat line of 6 receptions for 92 yards. He had 1 touchdown on 9 targets, and he ended up with 21.2 points in fantasy that week, so that was his only boom. And on the season, he had a total of 147.7 fantasy points. Yikes. Now, when we look at Brian Thomas Jr., it wasn't necessarily a surprise. I mean, it was, actually. It was a surprise. I knew he did well, but I didn't know how well he did. So he had 4 bust weeks, and then he had 6 boom weeks, and he ended up 4th in the player rankings. So he's up there with the elites. When we look over on the right-hand side, especially focusing on the FPTS column, we can see a lot of green there. And when we look at Week 15 specifically, that's against the New York Jets, where he had his biggest week of the season. So his season stats, he had 87 receptions for 1,282 yards. He had 10 touchdowns on 133 targets. So it's a pretty impressive line, which we're expecting that to only go up next year, as Trevor Lawrence will hopefully come back healthy. He had 6 carries for 48 yards, and then he ended up the season with 284 fantasy points. Pow, pow, pow. Yeah, we're going to be targeting this guy. When we look at that Week 15 matchup with the New York Jets, this is a game where he saw 10 receptions for 132 yards receiving, 1 touchdown on 13 targets. So that was a season high in receptions, and it was also a season high in receiving yards. That week he managed to amass 32.5 points in fantasy, probably helping those fantasy owners, secure that playoff spot. Well, I don't think we need to spend any more time looking at the stats. Brian Thomas Jr. clearly dominates Demario Douglas in this one-on-one matchup, and he is who we are selecting to advance to the next round. So Brian Thomas Jr. advances. Demario Douglas, he's out of here. Now let's take a look at the bracket to see how things are shaking up. The first matchup that we covered was Xavier Worthy from the Kansas City Chiefs going up against Khalil Shakir from the Buffalo Bills. We gave Shakir the nod over Worthy. There's a lot of different variables going in, so you can catch that. You can take a look at that in the prior video. We also did Ladd McConkey going up against Jerry Jeudy. That was the closest matchup that we've done to this point. We gave the nod to Ladd McConkey, so that's going to be pitting Shakir versus McConkey in round 2. And then when we get to the other side of the bracket, we had previously looked at Christian Watson versus DJ Moore. We gave DJ Moore the nod. For more information, you can check out that video. And then, so we had that emergency matchup with George Pickens and DK Metcalf after the offseason moves and the Pittsburgh Steelers acquiring DK Metcalf. We actually selected DK Metcalf to advance. There's a lot of things, the history with Russell Wilson, etc. You can check that out in the prior video. And because of that emergency matchup, Justin Jefferson, who I don't think anybody's going to disagree, we're just going to allow him to advance to the second round unopposed. If we have an opportunity to pair him up with another wide receiver as the offseason changes take place, and if we don't complete this video series by that time, we'll definitely take a peek. But for now, he advances to round 2. All right, the next matchup that we're going to cover puts Terry McLaurin from the Washington Commanders up against Calvin Ridley from the Tennessee Titans. That one's going to be fun because I definitely had some bias going into the season, specifically against Tennessee. I'll explain and show you exactly why in that video. But for now, I hope you enjoyed the breakdown. I hope you find this interesting as we're prepping for the fantasy season, and we'll see you in the next one.